Welcome to our 1968 talk. We did a version of 1968, the same 4 talks this afternoon at 12:30 on campus. We're redoing it right now. The talks will be just a little longer, and we will have the same 4 speakers in the same speaking order. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out this evening. I really appreciate this audience, and I didn't realize anyone was interested in 1968 except me, but there are a lot of you out there. Now, let me actually also give a few specific thanks to Ms. Paula Namus, who's running the technology, but also has been the driving force behind getting talks from the university here to the Marshall Public Library, where the parking is a little easier, not to mention many other things. Also to Emily Rose Rasmussen, who helped do the setup, and to the Friends of the Library, who were visionary enough a few years back to actually begin to take on this program. And I'd like to thank the SMSU History Club. If you're an SMSU History Club member, give yourself a hand because you helped make this happen. I'd also like to thank the driving force behind the 1968 idea, and that is Professor Jeff Kolnick. He's chairperson of the Social Science Department, and he'll be speaking last. So I'll introduce all of the speakers and then go into my talk. As I said, by the way, my name's Tony Amato. I don't think that was caught yet on the tape, so I've been talking for 5 minutes without introducing myself. The next speaker after I speak on this Prague Spring will be Jose Lozada Montero. He is a professor of Spanish at Southwest Minnesota State University. He'll be speaking on the student movements in Western Europe in 1968. And then after Jose Lozada Montero, we'll have Tom Williford, who will be speaking on Che Guevara in 1968, the iconic revolutionary. And then to run the anchor leg of our relay, we have Professor Jeff Kolnick, who will be speaking on the United States and Vietnam in 1968. So once again, I appreciate all of you coming. I'm going to start it off, and I'm going to Allyson Felix this one. Probably none of you got that in the audience, but you can look that up as you can look up many images of the Prague Spring. I'll put up a few. I'll read some from actual texts from people who participated in the Prague Spring. Well, what is the Prague Spring? Well, the Prague Spring took place 50 years ago in a country that no longer exists, and the Prague Spring was almost entirely about a system that no longer exists, and that's state socialism. We really have no state socialism left in the world as it existed in 1968, except in Cuba, North Korea, and Laos. And we have to think about that the Prague Spring really took place in a world that no longer exists, and on top of it, as I said, in a country that no longer exists. There's Slovakia, and there's a country now that wants to be called Czechia, or the Czech Republic. And they're separate countries and have been separate countries for a long time. Now, in addition to thinking about separate countries, I'd like to also get you to think about the 1960s and what kinds of cultural currents were at work in the 1960s. And a lot of people think about all kinds of controversial cultural pieces. Some of the most controversial cultural pieces came out of Czechoslovakia in the 1960s. These were 3 movies in particular, and you can watch these movies. I highly recommend them. Each is worth watching. First of all, it's The Shop on Main Street, which is a very dark take on the Holocaust. And it was a controversial film because it didn't describe any type of socialist victory. Rather, it described the plight of Jews in Slovakia, and it had an awful ending, but I'm not into spoiling a particularly awful ending. Another film, Fireman's Ball, directed by Milos Forman, when he was actually doing work that mattered, and it was made in the country called Czechoslovakia, was about incompetent bureaucrats and lechery. That's the best way to sum up that film, Fireman's Ball. And these were controversial films in the Czech Republic and also in Slovakia, even up until a few years ago because they carried messages that many people didn't want to hear. My personal favorite is actually a film called Closely Watched Trains, and Professor Gittins mentioned that she had seen this film. This film is about World War II. It's a sex comedy in World War II, and it describes the second most common male affliction. It's the one that's not cured with a blue pill, however, and these films were as more provocative than anything Hollywood was producing at the same time. Hollywood was still under the system of the large companies, and already the Czechoslovakian filmmakers were crossing lines. And in the middle of the 1960s, a whole program of censorship arose, began to show cracks. It had arisen under Stalinism. Stalin was the dictator of the Soviet Union who was responsible for putting pro-communist or outright communist regimes in most of the area that this country refers to as Eastern Europe. However, those people want themselves referred to as Central Europe, and they, to some degree, saw the Soviet influence and Soviet socialism as alien. I want you to actually reconsider socialism today and how it played into the Prague Spring. Now, there was a slow move away from Stalinism after his death in 1953. There was a thaw like we're having right now, a huge thaw where the winter of Stalinism will finally let up. Well, not until at least Monday, they are telling us, but and this was an opening for expression in the arts. It was also an opening for political dissent on some level or another. Now to actually get to my first image, how many of you have seen this car in person? Yeah, it's the greatest car ever. It's just 150 miles from us in the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. It is a masterpiece. It was actually designed between the wars, and it was made in Czechoslovakia in 1948, the same year that the non-communists walked away from the Slovak government and gave it over to the Communist Party. Why do I put this image up? Czechoslovakia in many ways was an advanced country, not just in design, but in actually making things. They had a consumer economy. But after the war, Stalin insisted that Czechoslovakia and other countries produce goods that were needed by other socialist countries in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Not only today, but back then, people were encouraging others to make steel, and Czechoslovak economic enterprises revolved around making steel and turbines rather than the actual consumer goods that consumers wanted. So this is key about the Prague Spring. A good deal of the discontent that led to it, and the good deal of the discontent actually expressed in its documents, are about consumer goods and the lack of an economy working. In the middle of the 1960s, Czechoslovakia was producing steel, using 5 times as much energy as Switzerland used, and using 4 times as many Swiss francs or Czech koruns to Czechoslovak koruns to produce it. And Czechoslovak people could actually feel the stagnation. It's always hard for me to go back to the past and remember it was a country, and to refer to both of the peoples and not exclude the second people, which are the Slovaks. And there were many other peoples in that country. And the Prague Spring also resulted in a permanent formal arrangement where Slovakia was recognized as a separate part of a federation. Now, this big move into heavy industry alienated many Czechs and many Slovaks, and Czechs and Slovaks actually sought to recapture some of the glory between the wars that they had experienced, and even some of the things that were made right after the war, rather than focus on heavy industry and deal with more and more shortages. Well, how did the Prague Spring start? Well, the Prague Spring was not really about consumer goods on its surface. It was about freedom of expression and freedom of speech and political dissent. And the starting event was not something that happened on the street. Rather, it was the publication of an issue of literary news in which a number of writers began to ask questions about why they were pre-censored in what they published. Why couldn't they speak about certain topics? And over the second half of 1967, more and more articles appeared in literary news criticizing censorship, also criticizing the lack of political openness in the country. There was trouble, too, in the actual Communist Party. The Communist Party was supposed to introduce people to a new era of prosperity. Socialism was just a transitory stage, ultimately before communism. That's what communists believe, according to Karl Marx. And the issue was, why was there so much discontent? And it was in part because there was a rigid top-down managerial system that frustrated even communists, where they couldn't get feedback or make decisions. And this system was run under Antonín Novotný. He was the first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. And when Leonid Brezhnev, who was the first General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the neighboring Soviet Union, the mother of all communist activity, so to speak, visited Czechoslovakia in 1967, Brezhnev did something rather odd. Brezhnev sided with the opposition, particularly after Brezhnev saw a student demonstration on his visit. He decided that Novotný needed to be removed, and so he removed Novotný and put in his place a Slovak named Alexander Dubček, an open reformer. Now, Alexander Dubček began his term in January of 1968, and he easily lasted through March of 1968, despite a number of efforts to remove him by fellow members of the Czechoslovak Party. There were a number of conspiratorial plans that have been called to light in just the last few decades about how people tried to actually get Dubček removed. Dubček favored freedom of expression. He wanted to eliminate all censorship. He also favored freedom of religion. That was a key thing, and that was maybe a little of his legacy that lasted in one area. I'll talk about that in a second. He asked that the economy would be put on track to serve consumers, and he also favored open political criticism of the party and shifts within the party that would turn it from a top-down organization into a bottom-up organization where no one actually feared being arrested or possibly even executed for their views. In April of 1968, Dubček came up with his action plan. He was the head of the Communist Party, and he said, this will be our plan for coming years. We are going to focus on giving people freedom, creating a humanitarian system for them, a system that is for people, not people for the system, but a system for people. He also favored economic reform, reform of the ruling party that was the government, and he put in place a Czech and Slovak federation where there were two different entities in a country. He embraced futurism. He said, this is about the future. He said, we cannot continue to operate in this Stalinist mode. He also made comments that many Czech writers had made that Czechoslovakia did not need to go about communism the same way Russia did, because Russia was a backward country. Czechoslovakia had great indigenous traditions that made cars like this, and as a result, they could afford to be more human. They didn't need to force themselves to meet goal after goal. They didn't need to repress freedom of speech or freedom of expression. By June of 1968, well into the spring, well, maybe it will be spring here this year, a party had emerged called the Social Democrats that was organizing and planning to challenge the Communist Party should there be elections. And that was something that had been absent in Eastern Europe since the 1940s. Moreover, one important author, actually came up with a statement called the 2,000 words. I won't read all of the 2,000 words, otherwise we'd be here until 9 o'clock. I just want to read several passages from the 2,000 words right now. And the 2,000 words was a statement by the author Ludwig Vaculik, and he talked about the desperate state of affairs. And he described how this occurred under Stalinism. He said, personal and collective honor deteriorated. Honesty led nowhere, and it was useless to speak of rewards according to ability. To sum up, the nation was in a morass that threatened its spiritual health and character. We are all responsible for the present state of affairs, with the greatest responsibility on the communists among us. No organization, however, was run by its members, not even the Communist Party. So Dubček is often best known for socialism with a human face. And essentially what Dubček was saying that inspired this person to write the 2,000 words was, this is an alien system. It belongs to no one. We need to reinvest our feelings, emotions, recreate our laws and procedures so that we have a system that serves the people, where socialism is humane. This particular statement, the 2,000 words, went too far for Dubček. Dubček was quite upset that the 2,000 words came out, and he tried to stop its circulation, but however, at that time, there was so much free information circulating in the Czechoslovak state that this circulated freely. It was an open criticism of the communist government. Now, the feelings began to spread to other countries during the summer of 1968, particularly neighboring Poland. And this is why the recent Czechoslovak events posed a danger to the Polish regime. Polish students actually demonstrated chanting, "Long live Czechoslovakia," and we want a Polish Dubček. And 2 Czechoslovak correspondents were actually expelled from Poland. They were journalists. They were told to leave Poland because these journalists were reporting on Poland's turmoil, and many people throughout the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union feared that this Czechoslovak virus, Czechoslovakia was in the middle of the Eastern Bloc, would spread to all countries very quickly. So in a rare event, everyone who was everyone in the Soviet Union actually appeared in Czechoslovakia in early August. This is one of the greatest photos ever. You can go online and see this photo. It's better than this car because it features all 4 really heavy hitters from the Soviet Union. Leonid Brezhnev himself, first Communist Party secretary, in other words, general secretary of the party. It features the head of the ministries. Also, it featured the head of the Soviet state. It featured the head party ideologist or ideologue, and it featured several other important figures in the Soviet Union at that time. They all converged on Slovakia to visit Dubček and talk to Dubček about the nature of what was going on. They raised questions about Dubček's revisionism and the possible threats that came with this. Dubček, however, really did not listen. So the Soviet Union was conducting military exercises during the summer, and these military exercises became larger and larger within Czechoslovakia, also within Czechoslovakia's neighbors. Channels, back channels of communications lit up, and the Soviet Union was actually looking for people to sign a letter asking for intervention to Czechoslovakia to remove Dubček and restore order to Czechoslovakia, because Dubček, of course, was a threat. On August 20th, large numbers of Soviet military airplanes arrived at the airport in Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, after paratroopers had seized the airport. And Soviet troops crossed the border. Also, every Warsaw Pact country's troops crossed the border except East Germany, because, of course, that was really something that was frightening to the Czechs and Slovaks, because that would be construed as another Nazi invasion. But every country did so except Romania. And the events that follow are probably the most well-known images of the Prague Spring. I'm just going to play them as I speak right here. These are images of tanks rolling through the streets of Prague. And there were efforts to resist. The efforts to resist were actually something that Alexander Dubček decried. He said, do not resist physically, do not resist violently. People chanted, they jumped on tanks, they hit tanks with sticks, and they set things on fire. But this was not Hungary in 1956. Hungary in 1956 led to over 10,000 deaths, and Hungary was an outright uprising with tremendous amounts of gunfire, months of fighting. This was largely a non-violent revolution where graffiti, protests, and sit-ins were the order of the day. The Soviet forces at some junctures just stopped fighting. They didn't want to run over people with tanks, and some did not. There were about 70 people throughout this two-day period who actually died. Some were crushed by tanks, others were beaten or bayoneted by soldiers. And this was occurring at the same time when Dubček himself was seized. Dubček was arrested. He was flown to the Soviet Union, to Moscow, and Dubček was made to sit in a room and sign a statement whereby he said that what had gone on for the past year in Czechoslovakia was unacceptable. It was counter-revolutionary, and the people of Czechoslovakia should accept and work with their Warsaw Pact friendly troops that had actually come into the country to save the country from itself, to save the country from revisionism that would lead them to the bad capitalist past. And you can see this free two-day period, not a period free of blood, but a period when people were running the streets, but these people were on the losing end, because there were over 600,000 troops from the Soviet Union or other Warsaw Pact countries in Czechoslovakia at that point. Resistance really was futile, and Czechoslovak people largely did not resist this Soviet intervention. The actual Prague Spring had a number of consequences. First of all, the Prague Spring actually resulted in the legalization of the Greek Catholic Church. It mattered for a small number of people in far eastern Slovakia. This was a church that actually was under the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy, but their ritual was the ritual of the Orthodox Church. Also, there was religious reform for Protestants as well. There was a guarantee for Lutherans and a guarantee for Czech Reformed practitioners of Christianity that they could practice without threats of arrest. And there was also even talk of larger religious liberty extending to Judaism. However, with the end of the Prague Spring, all of the religious tolerance quickly vanished, except that for the Greek Catholic Church, interestingly enough. But for the rest of religious practice, Czechoslovakia became one of the most bizarre countries on earth for religious practice, where priests belonged to a union. You had to belong to a union to be a priest. So maybe that's actually where unions should look. And then also the Czech Reformed Hussites were merged with the Lutherans. They actually had to be part of a separate religious denomination. And that was quite important afterward. Now, what were the long-term results of the collapse of the Prague Spring. Well, first of all, the Prague Spring was the event where the Brezhnev doctrine was articulated and came into practice. This would come up again in Afghanistan, where if a socialist country was faltering, its neighbors who are also socialists could decide to intervene in order to save that socialist country from counter-revolutionary forces. Now, here's how some of the dissidents who had to flee Czechoslovakia, these people were in high places either culturally or politically. Here's what they said. One, Zdeněk Suda, said, no matter what the most immediate motives for the invasion of the Soviet Union might have been, the operation earned the respect of military experts on both sides of the Iron Curtain as an absolutely flawless strategic move. On the political side, however, the intervention was far from flawless. In fact, the history of world communism has hardly seen a politically more confused operation. So a strategic triumph, a public relations disaster. Albania denounced this as imperialism. Imperialism in the 1960s was a dirty word. 50 new countries came about in the 1950s and 60s, rising up against and out of empires. And the Communist Party of Italy, France, and Finland, all of those communist parties condemned the Soviet action. So it split communist parties, not just people of the left, but actual communist parties, this intervention. Now, one of the people involved, Radek Sulitsky, would say, if I were to summarize the chief aims of the post-January social reform movement, I would say we are trying to achieve a positive, humane, and socialist victory over capitalism. This is not a Czechoslovak project of liberation and free markets, quite the opposite. The Prague Spring was based on an idea there could be a better socialism, socialism with a human face. And the same author says, for the first time in history, we wanted to make the humanist creed an everyday reality, unfettered by class rivalries or bureaucratic tyranny. Note that idea, that last idea. They felt they were under the tyranny of a bureaucracy, and bureaucracy had destroyed socialism. Oda Schick, who was the number 2 man in the Communist Party, an economist, described it like this. It is ironic that Soviet communism, which claims to be the sole exemplar and champion of a neutral, universal socialist revolution, has in fact become the most formidable obstacle to any advance toward a progressive and humane socialism. In taking Prague and the Czechoslovak state in the 1968 summer, the Soviet rulers have discredited socialism among large numbers of people who have felt that to be acceptable, socialism must be indivisibly connected with the historical development of a given country, its positive democratic traditions, and its economic level, and its wealth of indigenous customs and ideas. So in a sense, the Prague Spring was a socialist path not taken, a socialist vision that could not be exercised because it threatened other socialist states around Czechoslovakia. And I'd like to sum up with that. Thank you very much.
My name is José Losada. I'm the Spanish professor at SMSU. I came from Spain. I think there's nobody from Spain here. Any European, maybe? Okay. So I'm the only, okay. The only European here today. Okay. I heard that we might perform in the future for a longer, with more time. So right now what I'm gonna do is focus mainly in France and its student movement during 1968. And I hope that I can develop 1 or 2 ideas that might not explain but can frame what was going on in that country in 1968 with the student movements, and also ideas that might help us maybe to see differently what's going on nowadays with our students or our teachers movement here in US. One of the first ideas that I want to introduce is the need to understand that a student movement in Paris, in France, is not the result of anger against a conservative political party. It's more the result of frustration, disenchantment, disappointment with the political field, with Congress, Parliament, with a regular public institution that might no longer be valuable to increase, to improve the conditions of work for the labor, to improve the conditions of living, the quality of life of the citizens. So what's going on is just a disappointment with the political field. And a disappointment based in the rise also of the economic field. So the economic field, capitalism, and the agents within the economic field, they are getting more in power in order to refuse to accept public decisions that are decided there in a political field, in Congress, in Parliament, in Senate. So there's this disappointment with, for the students, for the youth in France at that moment, with the power of the political field, of the public institution. They are no longer a valuable tool by themselves to achieve things. So it looks like these young students, they feel like there's going to be the need to redefine this politics. There's going to be a need to redefine how to achieve things in the public arena. So there's the idea of introduce new subjectivities, new subjects, new political subjects, women, black people, students, teachers. They are going to be also people that needs to be involved in politics. Politics are not going to only be treated within Congress, within public institutions, but also in the street, public squares, libraries, student groups, neighborhood communities. So the public field, the political field, is not longer valid to achieve things by itself. It's going to need the help of all of us. I mean, we need to be political agents. We might not be in Congress, but we have the streets, but we have the public arena. So that's a little bit the idea that's going on at that moment. The idea of redefine politics and expand subjectivities and expand also spaces for politics. And I put this picture at the beginning because as you see, I mean, besides Portugal, I mean, with the exception of France, Portugal, and Spain, you see that at that moment, there are socialist parties in Italy, there are a socialist democratic party ruling Western Germany, also in the Scandinavian countries, the Labour Party in the United Kingdom. So it's not like they were hostile to workers, the political field at that moment. In fact, socialist, communist, and unions were running the government in all these countries. However, as I said, it was not enough to implement, it was not enough to improve the quality of life of the colleagues, of the members, and of the workers. So we need this idea of redefine that political field. Now, regarding the student movement in France is an anti-capitalist one, anti-colonial, and anti-authoritarian. And remember, it is this war against Vietnam is going on, but there's also a very recent war in France, the Algerian war. All the colonies, they are pretty aware of colonization. We know the history of France regarding colonization. And it's a very anti-Americanism feeling in the youth of France at that moment. Okay, so a lot of demonstrations in the streets against the Vietnam War. A lot of celebrations, for example, celebrations when El Pueblo, this American ship, was captured by North Korea in 1968. So there's celebration in the streets of France regarding that. So it's an anti-Americanism movement also, okay? Anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian, anti-American. And all these are demonstrations against the war of Vietnam. So we are in Paris, in the suburbs of Paris. This is the University of Nanterre. And this is March of 1968, end of March of 1968, at the end of a demonstration against Vietnam War, students ended occupying the chancellor's office. Okay? Some of these students were expelled of the university. Some of these students ended in the police office, and the university closed for 3 days, and then it had to close indefinitely. So this is a little bit the spark of these movements in Paris in 1968, the University of Nanterre and the occupation of the Chancellor's office. Now things start to get a little bit more hot, and we get May 10th, so several students that want to share that solidarity start to riot, start to organize in different campuses in Paris, in different universities also around the country of France. So we have 20,000 demonstrators in the street, and we need to understand the street also, as I said at the beginning, is a political arena. Okay, they perceive that they are doing politics over there. Actions that might help to increase our quality of life, actions that might help to improve conditions of life. So you see that 1,000 injured, all the detentions, and the importance of barricades, either with cars, but also bricks. And as I said in the morning, it's very important, the idea of barricades. Barricades, they have an important role in 1871 in the Paris Commune. This idea, somehow the first revolutionary socialist government for 40 days in Paris, this idea that the people can run a government for the people, lasts for 40 days in 1871 in Paris. So barricades has a very symbolic value in Europe and mainly in France. Okay, it signifies like a way to fight for the people fighting for the people with barricades in the street. So things, after this 20,000, we continue in the month of May, and as I said today in the morning, communist workers were expectant, were witnessing what was going on with the students, and at some point they decided to join them. So workers were struggling also to improve the quality of life, to improve their conditions, and they were not successful. Okay? Why? What we explained at the beginning. The economic field was empowered enough in order to refuse what was decided in the political field. So it was not working for them, so they decided to merge with the student movements. So we have 800,000 workers in the streets in May 13th. That's already the Communist Party with the students and unions. And several workers occupying different factories, aerospace. That first picture is a company called Sud Aviation, where they assemble airplanes. Here we have Citroën for cars, and this is the factory of Renault. So coal industry, automotive industry, and aerospace industry, there were the areas that people were striking and occupying the factories. And this is kind of the big day, May 20th, where you have around 10 million workers of France. That's 90% of the active population of France is striking May 20th. Occupation of 120 factories all around France, Nantes, Marseille, Paris. And this is the city hall of the city of Nantes, and you see that it's been occupied by workers of the Renault company, okay? So as I said, you have 10 million people in the streets. Now, this struggling, this using of public space, squares, this introduction of new political agents, students, neighborhood communities, study groups, professors, teachers, all this pressure ended with workers meeting with the Prime Minister of France. That meeting, it never happened before. It shows what I was trying to explain. Through the regular or orthodox procedure, they were not able to meet with the Prime Minister. So it was this new understanding of politics, this new pressure, we need to be in the streets, we need to be in the magazines, we need to be in the library, we need to be there, that make that the prime minister doesn't have more options that meet with the workers. So these conversations start May 25th and May 26th, and the meeting was successful for the workers. So they were offered a 35% more in the minimum salary, 10% more in all wages and salaries, and they were offered a 40 hours work week. Now, one of the second ideas that I want to develop, and it comes here, is that workers refuse this offer. So why they refuse that offer? So we need to understand now the contradictions within the movement, if not the contradictions within the movements. So we have young students, college students. We have young workers, and we have the leaders of the unions. Okay, we have to understand, leaders of the unions, leaders of the socialist parties were people in their 50s, were people that were raised in a fascist Europe, were fight against fascism. Okay, so there's a generational gap between two movements, the young students, the young workers, and these union leaders. So we have the old left, these union leaders that were willing to accept the offers of the prime minister. Why? Because for the old left, they perceive that democracy, the conquest of democracy, merged with having material improvements, with more consumer goods, with achieving, we are talking about a moment in 1968 where people start to have TV, washing machine, car. We are 50% of the population in Italy have a car, 50% have TV, only 23%, 25% have washing machine in 1965, 1968 in Italy, but was much better than in the 50s. Other places like Western Germany, almost it was a universal having TV and car at that moment. So what we're trying to explain, we have the old left that witness and struggle and fight to achieve that consumer goods, that material goods. That was a sign of achieving democracy. We didn't have heat when I was young. We didn't have a car. We didn't have TV. The fact of achieving those things, those material goods, signifies that we are achieving democracy. Now, for the young people that they were raised with that, that's not an achievement. They were looking for different way of understanding democracy. All of them were fighting for democracy, but we have these contradictions within movements. Democracy was differently meaning or signified for all of them, for each group. So the new left, these young people, they were not looking for these consumer goods. They were looking for self-management, for some kind of romantic values, respect, dignity. Okay, they were looking for all these values, not for material good. So what difference the old left and the new left is access to college. In 1968, 1965, it tripled the number of college students in Italy. It tripled in France, it doubled in Spain. In fact, in France, for example, you can go from high school to college without any selection in the 60s. Okay, so everybody that graduated from high school go to college. So the group of students, of course, not only get bigger, but it double and triple, and the access to consumer goods. So that is the difference between the new left and the old left. And as I said before in the morning also, there's this anecdote of a union leader in the 60s that reflects on his memories, and he's witnessing his daughter while eating and leaving part of the steak she was eating, so some leftovers for the night. And as a leader, as a union leader, this man expressing his memories that he felt kind of insulted, not because leaving food is a way of some moral or ethical issue, but because for him, having that lunch, having that meat on the table reflects an achievement in democracy. For the girl, she didn't understand that struggle. She cannot perceive that was an achievement. So there's this tension going on between the old left and the new left. So just to end, My paper is here. So just to end, these two ideas that I want to post is, in one hand, the contradiction between different movements, I have this quote: for a union leader that fight, that struggle with the students, but you still can see the contradictions within movements. And this, the minister of the Labour Party in UK, Edward Short, says about their colleague students. These people are not socialists. They are not even respectable Marxists. They are a new type of anarchists, very different from the enduring characters that many of us know. They are destroyers who only have an interest in upsetting the society. Their weapons are lies, misrepresentations, defamation, intimidation, and more recently, physical violence. So we understand the contradictions between these different movements. And the first idea, now that I will end with this quote too, is the idea that after '68, after the 60s, this is a reflection of a current professor of Michigan, a historian, regarding how Europe has achieved things after Second World War. The most important and lasting advances in democracy in Europe have only been achieved through turbulence and disorder, as a result of broader popular mobilizations and organized collective action, often in the midst of violent public confrontations of increasing importance. So the way Europe has been achieving things, democracy in Spain, and better conditions of working in France, has not been only through the orthodox public institutions or political field, through Congress, through Senate, but in our different way of understanding politics, understanding the street as a part of the political field, understanding libraries as part of the political field, understanding workers, women, and black as part of political subjectivities. And that's kind of a little bit the history of Europe after Second World War. Whatever we do in Congress, in the political field, in public institutions, need also to be complemented with different ways of understanding politics too. Thank you very much.
Good evening. My subject, of course, is Che Guevara. How is that, Paula? It's all right. So, my subject's Che Guevara. Che Guevara in 1968, it doesn't fit, actually. He's dead in October '67. So we're talking about a larger idea of 1968. And Che Guevara, most have seen the famous image, the T-shirt, the poster of the heroic revolutionary. Che was from Argentina. He was had an enormous revolutionary inspiration for all of Latin America, however. And this is where I kind of start off. He's sometimes considered the first Latin American. It sort of comes from his youth. He was studying medicine in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, and he decided with a friend to go on a trip on the motorcycle and by other means of transportation to know South America better. And it was on this trip where he and his friend Granados, part of it was to go and visit a leper colony in Peru. They had some connections there as doctors. They were interested in this theme. But it's where Che kind of fell in love with Latin Americans, and not the elites and the professionals and people of his social class or other doctors, but with the people, with the poor people who were trying to eke out a living as best as they could, miners, farmers, workers, and lepers for that matter, just regular folks that he felt that he needed to do something even more for. And so when he returned to Argentina and finished his degree, he went on to Guatemala. He chose Guatemala because in Guatemala there was a new reform government that was doing some exciting things under Presidente Arbenz. This poster shows Presidente Arbenz. This new government was going to give land to the peasants. And the sign there says, Presidente Arbenz cumplir. How do you say? There's so many different translations of cumplir. He complies with his promises to the peasant. Here is your land. Defend it. Take care of it. Cultivate it. Very much a nation-building kind of thing. That was exciting for all of Latin America. This example of agrarian reform. Instead of working for the large landowner, the individual peasant would be working for himself on his own land with his family. However, in Guatemala, and Che is there helping as best he can as a medical doctor, excited about this whole scene. He's starting to read Marx. However, in Guatemala, there was a particular large landowner that didn't like its land being taken away from it, and that was the United Fruit Company, huge banana company out of Boston, Massachusetts. And at the time, there were two brothers, the Dulles brothers. One was the head of the CIA, and the other was was the Secretary of State. And both of them were lawyers in Boston who had worked with the United Fruit, knew people from the United Fruit. The United Fruit people knew them, convinced them that what Arbenz was doing was communist. And so the CIA basically overthrew the government of Guatemala. But the important thing for our talk tonight is that Che Guevara was there. He saw this happen. He saw this happen, and he also followed Arbenz as he was leaving the country, said, I think all the foreigners who have come to help us out should also leave. So Che went across the border into Mexico. And here he encounters other exiles from other countries. He encounters the Castro brothers, specifically, of course, Fidel. Fidel Castro at this point, in 1955, had already led a revolt against the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. An unsuccessful revolt. Castro was captured, put on trial, jailed, and then he was freed by the Batista regime that was trying to make itself look a little more human rightsy for the United States at that point. But Castro was no fool. He went into exile in Mexico as well. And he immediately started planning another attack, another revolt to overthrow Batista on the island of Cuba. And so this is where Che Guevara comes in, meets Castro, is very impressed with him, wants to join this idea of forming a guerrilla force to land in the eastern part of the island of Cuba and start a revolution. And they do that. They land in the Sierra Madres, and from there they sort of snowball. They get the support of the local poor campesinos, and you get the Cuban Revolution. Che and Fidel, working together with an increasingly larger group of guerrillas, were able to train people, get the locals on their side. And when Batista, the hated dictator, when Batista was sending in his troops, they were able to defend themselves and gain more arms and more support and even start to go on the attack. So that by late 1958, by which time the U.S. government had pulled its support from Batista, stopped selling the regime arms. By that time, they were on the offense. Che Guevara himself, this medical doctor, had become a skilled enough guerrilla to lead one of the columns to take over the city of Santa Clara in the middle of the island. And by that time, it was over. Batista decides to, he gets the message, leaves Cuba, and Cuba is free of Batista. Celebrations on the streets, and Castro and Che and the gang move into Havana. And they're working with others. I think this is a point we'll come back to. The guerrillas certainly had the guns, and they started doing some very important things to have the revolution. But initially they were supported by the middle class, by certainly university students, of course, regular farmers and shopkeepers. Everybody hated Batista as a corrupt, a horrible, repressive dictator that needed to get out of their country. Cuba deserved better. And so people were excited to get rid of Batista, welcomed the guerrillas into Havana when they arrived. However, Che is there. And of course, Castro knows what has been going on the last few years. Che witnessed what happened in Guatemala. And so immediately the revolutionary guerrillas take over the army. They're not going to have, because what the CIA did in Guatemala was get a few army officers on their side and overthrow the government. That was not going to happen in Cuba. And as we already noticed, there's this sort of underlying fear, anti-Americanism. It wasn't completely clear at the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, but as the tensions rise between the United States and Cuba, things begin to quickly become very anti-American. So Che immediately gets involved in the revolutionary government. And not as a medical doctor, but as the being in charge of industry, sort of the economics minister, and eventually even the treasury ministry, and trying to foment a Cuban economy based on socialist principles, kind of a command economy. Of course, by that time, the embargo had begun. Cuban sugar was not being purchased by the United States. It was being purchased at rock-bottom prices by the Soviet Union. There's problems with this, but Che was devoted to this idea and wanted to also be the revolutionary example, that what Cuba needed was people to have a true workers, socialist workers feeling that what their labor is doing is to build their country, to make a better future for Cuba and to be an example perhaps for the world. By 62, 63, 64, Che is sent out more as a diplomat to the rest of the world. Che is the one who met with Khrushchev and asked him after the Bay of Pigs, hey, how about putting some missiles on the island to defend us from the United States? And that kind of leads to the October 62 missile crisis. But Che does famously go on to give speeches at the United Nations. He's interviewed around the world. He's known as very articulate for his very clear ideas. He begins to talk about how national liberation should be happening all over the world, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in the rest of Latin America. As he put it, 2, 3, many Vietnams. Many Vietnams. He felt that these former colonized peoples should revolt and keep that kind of revolt going. As such, I think we were discussing this in class the other day. He's getting a little older. He's in his mid to late 30s. He's getting close to his midlife crisis. And he sort of decides that what I should do is become a guerrilla again. That was sort of the highlight of his life. And by this time, of course, he had this foci theory of guerrilla warfare, in which if you had a committed group of guerrillas, of guerrilla fighters, well organized, that they could get the poor people on their side. This was his interpretation, that's an important word here, of what happened in Cuba. Get the people on their side, snowball into a large revolt, and they can overthrow the hated regime, whether that be a hated dictator, a neo-colonial imperialist regime, or a capitalist regime, that a committed group of revolutionaries could overthrow a government and install the revolution. And so he decides, mid-1960s, he decides the place to go is the Congo. And so he secretly goes off to the Congo to try to organize the guerrillas there. The Congo, when it became independent in 1959, 1960, from Belgium, they elected a president, Patrice Lumumba, who openly advocated a degree of socialism in his country. And the United States, this is after the Cuban Revolution, of course, the United States, Western Europe, the Belgians, it's not all roly-boly. They went in there with the paratroopers, and Lumumba was assassinated by a political rival, and the situation fell into a state of guerrilla warfare. And this is when Che shows up in 65, 66, and tries to replicate what he did in Cuba. But he decides within a few months that this situation is extremely confusing. There's so many different groups, they have different loyalties to local folks, and On top of it, he doesn't really understand the languages, and he decides this is not going to work in Congo. I need another place to go. So instead, he goes back to Cuba secretly again and decides that the place ripest for a Cuban revolution would be Bolivia, since they had very low GDP, very poor peasants that perhaps had a little more land on their, by that time, but could liberate themselves from the horrors of capitalism that was oppressing them and keeping them poor, and that he could form a guerrilla group to overthrow that government in Bolivia. And so he goes to Bolivia, disguised. When you see I don't have all the photographs up here, but he actually shaved his head, male pattern baldness with put gray in his hair, and was able to sneak into Bolivia. And others had already gone there ahead of him. Other Cubans, revolutionaries, the revolutionary Tamarabunki, who went there to start to organize this sort of guerrilla uprising, to try to make contact even with the Bolivian Communist Party, and do all this sort of organizing. And then once Che arrives, he's got a group of a dozen or so fighters, many of them Cubans who volunteer to go with him. And you can see him in this photograph. He's wearing the hat covering where he had his artificial bald spot with Cuban and Bolivian fighters. And it doesn't work well. Reading his Bolivian diaries, we have he was a great diary writer. He kept the diaries of his trip across South America, the motorcycle diaries. And the Bolivian diaries, he's writing down daily or every other day what's going on. And it was rough for them. One thing about Che Guevara is he had severe asthma. And so occasionally, which is interesting to see him smoking cigars and pipes all the time. Anyways, he had asthma, and trying to find asthma medicine became a big issue. When you read these diaries, it's like, I can't breathe, I got to... And along with it, he has this group of rookie fighters. You do have these trained Cubans, but the Bolivians aren't quite with it. He can't get it together with the Bolivian Communist Party. It's very frustrating for him. And at one point, he meets with his group to try to inspire them. They've been attacked a couple times by the military. They've had some victories, but they've been attacked, and their forces split and everything. And I love this what he says here, because it really expresses his passion. And he's telling the guerrilla fighters here, this is one of those moments when great decisions have to be made. This type of struggle gives us the opportunity to become revolutionaries, the highest form of the human species. And it also allows us to emerge fully as men. Those who are unable to achieve either of those two states should say so now and abandon the struggle. And this is a person who had a lot of passion. I think in another context, the more you read Che and see what Che's life was like, in another context, in another century, he would have been a saint. He would have been one of these people to inspire others to greatness. And that was his passion. Just the highest form of the human species is a revolutionary. And there's also that masculinity to become fully formed as men. But he also goes on to write, after he gives this inspiring speech, all the Cubans and some of the Bolivians committed themselves to stay until the end. And so did Eustaquio. But he criticized Maganga for putting his backpack on the mule and for not carrying firewood, which provoked an angry response from Muganga. Julio lashed out at Moro and Pacho for similar reasons, which brought another angry response, this time from Pacho. It's like, here's this great revolutionary leading a very poorly organized Cub Scout pack. Because here they are in the middle of the jungle, and it's like, well, he's not carrying his backpack. He's putting it on the mule. I got to carry everything. It's like, Che had to have been just so frustrated with these jerks. But this is what, he's committed to this foci theory and committed to trying to get this revolution going. And so I often think when this was first published, very popular, the Bolivian diaries, And people reading them were like, okay, we can see what Che wanted. You can see that these guys didn't get it. And the problem was these guys didn't get it. But it doesn't end well for Che, as we already know. In October 1967, it's kind of an unflattering photograph of Che when he's captured. But there he is, captured by the Bolivian army. And the Bolivians, trained by the Americans, the Bolivians decide to execute him. And it seems like the CIA probably would have preferred that he was kept alive and put on a public trial and perhaps even an international trial for, because they could certainly make the case this is almost imperialism, right? The Cubans are coming in. But that didn't happen. The Bolivian army decided to execute him. And so he becomes a symbol of the struggle of national liberation for the rest of the world. But there's also, it sort of indicates a problem here with his foci theory. What really happened in Cuba was, yes, a devoted, well-organized guerrilla movement, but everybody on the island, except for Batista's cronies, hated Batista. Bolivia was, I mean, he couldn't even get the Communist Party to side with him. So just how much was there a revolutionary situation? And we'll see how this works out. But this happens in October 1967. Already, Che is the example for revolution. In January 1968, his image appears among protesters against the Vietnam War on the streets of Berlin. I was trying to find a photograph if he shows up in France. I'm sure the image is there. I'm not sure where they got the image from our poster, but he's right there on the streets already. And later in 1968, in October, Mexican students are out on the street. I think everything we've talked about here, you've got Prague, the Prague Spring, you have May 1968 in France. Students are seeing what's happening in Europe, seeing what's happening in the rest of in the United States for that matter, and they want to go out and protest. And this happens in Mexico as well, protesting against probably the Vietnam War as well, but among many other things, a repressive, corrupt regime under the PRI in Mexico. And as you can see, there's Che, hasta la victoria siempre. Always towards the victory and for the homeland, for the patria. And patria or muerte. And it didn't turn out too well for the Mexican students. This was just 10 days before the Summer Olympics. Mexico was supposed to be on its best behavior. They sent in the tanks and the army, and nearly 300 were killed, and thousands were jailed at this point. But the inspiration of Che goes beyond just Latin America and Europe. It's also all over this hemisphere, even in the United States. How many of you recognize who this is? Patty Hearst. That the Symbionese Liberation Army, a small, quite frankly, a guerrilla group in Northern California, kidnapped wealthy heiress Patty Hearst, heir to the Hearst newspaper fortune, media fortune. And they're able to get her parents to buy all this, get food for the poor. But she also flips the old Stockholm Syndrome. And she joins the guerrillas and calls herself Tanya. And as she put it in a tape sent to her parents, I am not Patty anymore, I am Tanya, the name of Che Guevara's last lover in Bolivia, the Tamara Bunke, who went by the name of Tanya. And so even in the United States, you have this inspiration coming for Che Guevara. So still, it's sort of the exception proves the rule. The one place where there was committed revolutionaries overthrowing a hated government was Nicaragua in 1979. But again, that was very similar to Cuba. You had the Somoza family in dominating that country for decades, a corrupt family that stole earthquake aid that was meant for Managua when it was devastated in 1972. They were just terrible, terrible, corrupt people. the assassination of a newspaper editor. Just people were on the streets. The ones with the guns were the Sandinistas. And eventually they do kind of take over the government, but we're much more democratic than the Cuban Revolution. There's a whole story there. But the theory of Che really only comes into play once we get into Nicaragua in '79. But Che is still out there, influencing and inspiring the youth around the world. This is a photograph of this guy, me, in the Plaza de Che, just this past December at the Universidad Nacional in Bogota, Colombia, where I did my master's about 20 years ago. And there's a plaza devoted to Che Guevara, and his image is right up there, and they call it the Plaza de Che. So still there, that dedicated revolutionary as an inspiration to youth and to many throughout the world. Whether or not his theories work is only Nicaragua, as far as I can see. But on the other hand, there is that passion to try to respond, as we've already seen in the other presentations, that you have to respond sometimes in a different way to achieve your goals. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I should wrap this up in 45 minutes or so. Just kidding. It's not true. So I want to talk a little bit about the U.S. and what was going on in Vietnam in 1968. And just by way of preface, by the time the United States, by the time it's 1968, the United States has been, I'd say, pretty thoroughly involved in Vietnam since 1945. Really earlier, since about 43, and then the escalation of the wars in 65. So there's about 500,000 troops in Vietnam by 1968, and we've been in it for more than 20 years. And by 1968 is a highly consequential year, and I just want to say, by way of the other presentations, what a great panel it was to be on a panel with these guys. But I also want to say that one thing you can see from it is that there's revolutionary activity afoot in 1968. It's afoot in Prague against a communist regime. I mean, a revolutionary socialists against a communist regime. 10 million workers in the streets in Paris rejecting a 35% increase in the minimum wage, and Che Guevara carrying out revolutionary activity in Latin America, and of course in the United States there's activity as well. So in 1968 in Vietnam, like all historians, I'll push it back to 1967. At the end of 1967, William Westmoreland declared that there was light at the end of the tunnel and that victory was just around the corner. And that was based on a policy of what they called attrition. And the Vietnam policy of attrition was that we were able to kill more Vietnamese people than they could put back into the field. So the idea of attrition was that the United States reported that there were 285,000 members of the National Liberation Front. Those were the guerrilla forces in the South, and the North Vietnamese troops, Viet Minh troops, that the Vietnamese could put in the field 285,000 regular army and guerrilla forces, and that the entire U.S. strategy was based on this number. And by late 1967, Westmoreland reported that we were able to kill more Vietnamese than they could replace, meaning that the number of troops that the Vietnamese could put in the field was declining for the first time in 1967. And they saw that as light at the end of the tunnel, meaning if we continue with this policy, we'll eventually destroy their army by killing more of them than they can replace. Unofficially, the CIA reported that the actual order of battle was not 285,000, but between 500 and 600,000. There's a great story about a direct descendant of John Adams who entered the CIA, like the great-great-grandson of John Adams, entered the CIA and was given the task of determining the order of battle. How many troops did the enemy have in the field? And he determined that it was 500 to 600,000, indicating that we were not winning the war, that we were not replacing them as fast. When he reported that to his superior, it got up to the head of the CIA, who said that this Lyndon Johnson cannot see this. We cannot share this, and they put the number into a safe eventually. And it made it to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Earl G. Wheeler, who knew the number, and said if these figures should reach the public domain, they would literally blow the lid off Washington. Please do whatever is necessary to ensure that these figures are not, repeat, not released to the news media. Well, the entire U.S. strategy was based on a false premise of how many soldiers we were fighting. And when the Joint Chiefs said, well, how can we do this? They said, well, you know, the 300,000 others are just our weekend warriors. I mean, they just fight at night and on the weekends, you know, so we're not going to count them. Literally, I'm not exaggerating that's not the exact language they used, but that's the thrust of what they said. We're not going to count them because they're kind of part-time. This guy, Adams, eventually resigned from the CIA and tells his story himself later. So William Westmoreland, when he announced that there was light at the end of the tunnel at the end of 1967, actually increased the popularity of the war to about 50%. But after the Tet Offensive begins in January of 1968, support for the war declines really quite rapidly. The Tet Offensive was a strategy. So the U.S. had its strategy, and of course the Vietnamese had their strategy, and their strategy was to get the United States to leave. And eventually we were going to leave, right? I mean, everybody knew that one day the United States was going to leave, that Vietnam was not going to be the 51st state. The Vietnamese knew it, we knew it, so the Vietnamese goal was to get us to leave as rapidly as possible. So the war had been fought primarily in the countryside, and during Tet, the idea was that the National Liberation Front, the irregular forces of the South, would lead the fight against the U.S. forces and the South Vietnamese Army, and they would take it to the cities. And in every provincial capital and virtually every major city in Vietnam, the National Liberation Forces took control of those cities for sometimes a very brief period of time, sometimes for periods of weeks, and in Hue, the ancient capital, for several weeks in one of the most horrible battles of the war. And for a brief period of time, occupied the U.S. Embassy. I mean, even Saigon was threatened by these forces. The effect of that was that the American people began to question whether victory was possible in Vietnam. 1967, when Westmoreland publicly said that we were winning because of the crossover point, polls showed that the U.S. approval of the war stood at 50%. After Tet, the figure dropped to 33%. That would be in February, just a couple months later. And 49% of Americans at that point believed that we should not have been involved in the first place. So the support for the war hovered in the upper 40s to above 50% from the 1950s through 1967. It dipped temporarily. You know, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in 67, they finally they put a war tax on the American people, and that kind of dipped the support for the war once people had to start paying for it. But it went back up when Westmoreland said, we're going to win this baby. And in February 27, 1968, Walter Cronkite got on the television news as a result of the Tet Offensive and said, tonight, back in more familiar surroundings in New York, we'd like to sum up our findings in Vietnam, an analysis that must be speculative, personal, subjective. Who won and who lost in the Great Tet Offensive against the cities? I'm not sure. The Viet Cong did not win by a knockout, but neither did we. We've been too often disappointed by the optimism of American leaders, Cronkite said, to have faith any longer in the silver linings they find in the darkest clouds. For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe in the face of the evidence the optimists who have been wrong in the past. And Lyndon Johnson is reported to have said after Cronkite signed off, if we've lost Walter Cronkite, we've lost America. It's at this point, we think that the American people were always opposed to the war in Vietnam. In fact, that's not the case. The American people supported, as we always do, our troops in the field for a long time. before the American people said, what are we doing there? And I will just say that we've been involved in conflicts for a long time now. A long time now. You know, longer than most freshmen have been alive. So part of the response in Vietnam was to the Tet Offensive was the extraordinary violence that occurred. So when the Vietnamese launched that offensive, the United States and the South Vietnamese fought back with tremendous ferocity. As we see in Prague or in Bolivia, the counter-revolution is always aggressive and well-armed, and such was the case. My Lai, we know about, people have heard about it. It's estimated that among the dead were 182 women, 17 of them pregnant, 173 children, including 56 infants, 60 older men, probably my age or older, murdered. What we have here is an image of some of the image of the mass executions, and this is a recent memorial that was built around the 50th anniversary near the site of the massacre. I think it's important to understand that right adjacent, the area around My Lai experienced multiple killings like this, none as extensive as this. This was around 400 to 500 dead, as we point out, many of them women and children and elderly men. But in villages around there, it was part of the U.S. policy to, quote, kill anything that moves. There were free fire zones, and U.S. generals were rewarded based on body count. One of the things that you'll note in the war since Vietnam, we don't do body counts anymore. We don't report on we don't say we're winning because we're killing the enemy. We don't, it's apparently we kill nobody. We're over there fighting, and nobody's dying, except some of our people. In Vietnam, they reported the body count on television. How many dead? Yeah. And that was because we were saying, if we can kill more of them than they can put in the field, we'll win. So the whole war was based on body count, and we killed a lot of people. And a lot of us died, and a lot of South Vietnamese died. But in another village called My K 4, U.S. soldiers of Bravo Company on the same day committed atrocities that led to 97 dead. Again, women, children, and elderly. And those aren't the only two. There were multiple examples of that, all in that particular region that was particularly difficult to control. As a consequence of the activities of 1967, the President of the United States, the general in charge of the operation, saying that there was light at the end of the tunnel and that victory was just around the corner, led to what we've called the credibility gap, or the inability of the American people to believe what it is the presidents are telling us or our elected officials are telling us. There's Lyndon Johnson. I think he had some kind of appendix out or his gallbladder out, and he would show his scar, right? So there's the map of Vietnam for his scar. And then Nixon, of course, in the Watergate Pinocchio nose. Many of us don't realize that the problem of Watergate, or the scandal of Watergate, began as a result of Vietnam when Nixon and Kissinger ordered secret bombing in Cambodia. And when the bombing was discovered by reporters who heard the kaboom, Nixon thought it was a leak. Someone leaked the bombing to the press. And so then he formed an organization called the Plumbers. And the plumbers were supposed to plug the leaks, right? And stop the leaking of the press. And that's what led to the Watergate scandal that had its origins right in Vietnam. Nixon had a secret plan to get us out. That's how he was elected in '68. And the war, U.S. involvement in the war finally ends in 1973, 5 years later, in what Marilyn Young calls a savage retreat, the 5 years after Johnson. So and that's just what's happening in Vietnam. And of course, in the United States, we're in a state of self-destruction. And we'll talk about that in the fall. Professor Gittins, myself, and Professor Anita Gall will talk about the U.S. election of 1968, and then we'll have 2 more sessions on culture, dealing with music and art and film and fashion, literature. And so we'll complete the 68 series. And I think we're going to come to the library and do the one on the women's movement and civil rights as well. We'll do that here at the library. We didn't get to the library for that. So I think that's all I have to say. Thank you very much. And if there's any questions, I think any of us will take them. Questions or comments? Go ahead.
This is for any of you. One thing that just fascinates me about this insane year of 1968 is, was there like a global contagion? I mean, how did all of this focus down into essentially 1 year's time? Was the dawn of satellite communication the glue that, it's like there was this big lens that was focusing all of the sunlight down into 1968 and all of these different parts of the world. It's just amazing.
You want to take a crack at it?
Oh, I think it was Che. No. No, I think it was, I would say it's a generational thing too. I think, as you're pointing out, this is the generation after World War II is examining what's going on with the world and reacting to it. And somebody born in 1946 was 22 years old in 1968. Perhaps some of you in the room. But,
Some of us were juniors in high school.
right. But it was what we see here really is the youth reacting to this and reacting to the other generation.
And I would just say, I think that's absolutely part of it. I was going to say the same thing, actually. I think so, and I think Jose kind of got at that as well. There was this youth that saw the struggles of their parents as insufficient, right? In other words, if you don't have heat's a victory, right? But if you grow up with heat, maybe you want autonomy, because you've got heat, right? So that I think there's a lot going on there. But I think the other piece to recognize is that 68's a big year. But there was a lot of activity in 67 and 69, right? So the fact is 68 has a major shift in Vietnam as a result of a Vietnamese offensive that had nothing to do really in a way that was internal to them. But we can see 68, and there was an election year in the United States, but we can see 68 as, we have to see it in the context of 64, 65, 66, 67. Then there was a lot of activity in 68. I'm not going to lie to you, and there was a lot of activity in 69 and 70. So, but I don't know how you explain, when you have these cataclysmic years like that. I don't know how you do it. It's a good question. Nice shirt, by the way.
Yeah. Really quick, you're on the right track with satellite. I think, though, that's a year later when you begin to have the first regular, reliable satellite feed. But also consider jet air travel as well. And yes, we could be looking at the Summer of Love, and we could go back in the time machine to do this last year, where the Summer of Love also do the Six-Day War. And I think a fair amount of it is really based on media and easy access to distant places, and all of a sudden the world seems much smaller.
And I will add at least in Europe, the consumer goods, what we said, the access to much more material goods. I have here some data. So we are in 55, Italy, there were 12% of houses have a TV in Italy, in 55. In 65, 10 years after, it's raised to 49%. I mean, TV made a huge difference. I mean, we have these young students in France getting in real time what was going on in US or in Vietnam. It was like the internet of 50 years ago was TV. And it was to I mean, appear in a kind of a universal way in Western Germany, in Spain, in France. I think TV make a huge difference for young people to be aware of what was going on in other parts of the world. I will give some credit.
And there was a kind of journalism, like that was a different kind of journalism that was appearing for a brief period. We imagine these heroic investigative journalists, but it's it actually is, that's also kind of a discrete period of time as well. But the TV piece is huge, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think of it, think of my parents in World War II. They would go to the movies and they'd watch these newsreels
yeah.
just put out by the government, and everybody, of course, thought the same way, and was, well, for us, it was totally different.
Propaganda, yeah. Yep.
Tet happened in January, February?
Yep. And I think it lasted longer in some places than others, yeah, absolutely. Persisted past January and February.
And then Johnson announces he's not going to run for re-election.
Yeah, it must be March.
March 31st.
Okay. It seemed to be the anniversary.
And we're going to handle that. I think Dr. Gittens, we're going to let her take half an hour, and she's going to deal with the whole Democratic Party, and then Dr. Gall is going to do Nixon, and I'll do Wallace. And we'll handle that kind of 68. We'll handle that 68 piece that way, because there is a kind of self-destruction of the Democratic Party in '68, kind of, and it, Mm-hmm.
How much do you think the war in Vietnam influenced the rest of the world? I mean, just the fact that it was on TV
Mm-hmm.
And broadcast throughout the world. How big an influence did that have, do you think, to Paris and Mexico and wherever?
Well, I actually brought this up at 12:30, so if you could take a time machine and go back and sit in that lecture hall. One piece of graffiti that regularly appeared on August 20th and August 21st in Prague and thereafter was CSSR, and CSSR is Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. CSSR, USSR, 1968. US, Vietnam, 1968.
It had a global impact, and I think one of the things I don't remember who said it, if it was one of the three of you brought up all the nations that liberated themselves, but yeah, was that Tony?
Yeah. 50 new countries between the 1950s and 1968.
And of course, Vietnam tried to liberate itself in '45, and then defeated the French in '54, and then the United States kind of took over for the French. So we have to recognize that colonialism, in a formal sense, persisted into the 1960s, like old-fashioned colonialism, persisted into the 1960s and really into the 1970s, and in South Africa longer. I mean, and that would be not counting colonizing nations that are still taking over indigenous lands. But I mean, just old-fashioned, countries ruling others persisted into the 1970s. And so the Vietnam piece, I mean, had a global impact because we were the top dog, and we were not able to defeat a tiny nation of gorillas. We know now that they had tremendous support from the Chinese and the Soviets, not troops on the ground, but a lot of support. So it had a global impact. Che 2-3 many Vietnams, and the French, right.
Jose was showing, they were protesting in Berlin, January.
Right.
During the Tet Offensive, now that I put the
Right.
months together. Yeah.
So it was a kind of recognition that colonialism, that the European and the Americans were no longer had a critical mass of people that would tolerate any longer remaining a formal empire. And I think we have a high tolerance for informal empire, but not so much for formal. Other questions?
You wonder how things might have been a little different if one of our presidents might have said to Ho Chi Minh, you know what you're saying about George Washington, we kind of like that.
Yeah.
And if somebody, Major League Ball had told Fidel he played ball.
Got that contract with the Yankees, yeah.
A few different things there.
Right, but I think several presidents had that chance and didn't take it. Yeah. Dan?
For Professor Amato, do you see any parallels with the current fascination with fashionable fascism in the Central European countries, and almost a desire to, if not shackle themselves back to the Russian Federation, to somehow adopt Putin-like kind of kleptocracy kind of principles to run their governments in a similar kind of fashion? I mean, what kind of parallels and lessons can be drawn from things like the Velvet Revolution and the Hungarian uprising to this unbelievable specter of Hungary embracing a fascist leader? Czech Republic looking like it's going that way. Poland definitely. Those essentially.
That's an excellent question, and 1968 seems so hopeful in Prague because they have a direction and it's humane. And really, since the 1989 revolutions, institutions that are humane have not fully been built in these countries, and bad contagions and viruses have spread. The bad contagion of big money and corruption, the bad contagion of idealizing national pasts that weren't all that ideal, and the bad corruption, of course, of not standing up for what is right, particularly not standing up to a bullying figure in a neighboring country. Well, no longer neighboring any of those countries except Poland, and I think you can guess which country that is. And to really think about this, one of the problems of 1968 was that 1968 for Czechoslovaks began with self-examination. However, as time passed, they more and more came to see it as though hostile aliens, in other words, Soviet forces, forced something on them in 1968, and theirs was a true revolution. So you always have to be scared of seeing yourself as your own liberator. The very thing that you don't like most, the habits of democracy, the tough work, therein lies the liberation, not some heroic moment of liberation.
Other questions? Well, thank you all very much.